Breaking news coming in. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney says he can't rule out his country's military participation in the escalating war in West Asia.
Alongside his Australian counterpart, Anthony Albanese, he said that in Canberra, one can never categorically rule out participation. He added that we will stand by our allies, and the remarks come a day after he said the US-Israeli strikes on Iran were inconsistent with international law. Well, this is the breaking we're getting. The Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney says he can't rule out his country's military participation in the escalating war in West Asia. Alongside his Australian counterpart, Anthony Albanese, he said that in Canberra, one can never categorically rule out participation.
All right, to discuss this further, we're now being joined live by Bishop Garrison, former senior advisor to the Secretary of Defense and current senior fellow and adjunct professor, National Security Institute at George Mason University Law School. Mr. Garrison, thank you so much for joining us. Let's just start with what we just broke for our viewers, the participation of Canada and Australia. Now, a few days earlier, Australia had said that they don't wish to get involved. Do you feel the kind of reaction that Spain got from the US president has brought out these statements from other countries, and do you think they'll get involved?
Well, yeah, no, thanks for having me. Honestly, I would have been more surprised if they had said categorically that they would not or could not be involved in any way, shape, or form in this conflict. Where this puts a lot of allies in difficult situations, and they're going to have to make some difficult decisions. But I think it would be detrimental to long-standing relationships if they were to say absolutely that under no circumstance they would step in. This just gives them some level of leeway of movement for future decision making should they decide that it's necessary for them to be a part of any type of operation.
Mr. Garrison, actually, Australia did rule out military role in the Iran conflict. That's headlines just from 3 days ago, and now we heard this statement. So, there has been a change in stance that we're seeing, and France already decided to deploy its military assets. So, do you feel now it's going to be just on paper, or do you really find more military assets from other countries and friendly nations with the US getting involved as US gets more embroiled in this?
Well, I mean, it's just too early to tell, and it also depends on what type of involvement we're ultimately talking about. There's already a need for some assistance in terms of just movement of civilians out of the theater of operations for the United States. So there are ways that allies can absolutely support what is some of the activities that are going on that deal more on the humanitarian side than any parts of the kinetic conflict. So again, these statements are just ultimately giving a lot of these allies some leeway to support the missions in a way that really resonates with their own citizens, because quite frankly, this isn't the most popular decision-making processes right now when it comes to this conflict.
Right, and Mr. Garrison, having talked about the ambiguity and the shifting stance, we also know that the Trump administration has been facing a lot of scrutiny over its shifting rationale as to the war with, Iran. And now the U.S. Senate has backed his military campaign with a 47-53 vote. Now, but we also know historically that a prolonged conflict without a clear endgame does, erode the domestic support. How vulnerable does that leave the political landscape in U.S.?
Well, I don't think that that vote is particularly the strongest in terms of supporting a president who has entered into a conflict. If you look at the actual vote, it's along partisan lines. So that's the first part. Next, we know that the Senate Congress, both House and Senate, are going to be potentially considering additional funding of this overall effort for the United States. And that's going to be a bigger task and a bigger test to see whether or not Congress is going to affirmatively support what the White House has done in entering this conflict. That's very different from the type of resolution that you're kind of speaking to here, and looking at curbing the War Powers Act. This is something which we're talking about actually appropriating funding to move forward with the conflict. So a lot more is going to have to come out and debate in the coming days and weeks.
Mr. Garrison, as far as now the war is concerned when it comes to what's happening inside Iran? How much do you feel the interior workings of Iran have been, I'm not talking about military assets, of course, we're hearing of all the damage that has been caused, but when it comes to the leadership or a change in leadership, it pretty much seems to be in line with what the earlier regime was. They already have a successor in mind, and I think it's just a matter of time before it is formally announced.
Well, I think the one thing is clear, and you don't have to be any type of special intelligence analyst to understand this, but it seems as though the Iranian government was really anticipating at some point this type of attack, this type of operation, and they were several levels deep in their succession planning. So when they began to have these levels of attrition and they began to lose leadership, they have people in mind within the organization that can fleet up quickly and fulfill these positions. So ultimately, it's going to be almost a game of whack-a-mole when you talk about trying to determine who is going to be the best strategic target to actually engage in order to damage or collapse the overall government, the regime. So I think this is going to be something that we're going to find some difficulty in moving forward.
Right, and Mr. Garrison, while changing the regime is one thing, but ensuring what comes after is a completely different ballgame altogether. Now, how do we know that what has been unleashed now, how is it going to be contained? Because we understand that Iran is much more complicated, it's multi-layered. So what are the chances of it actually spilling over, as the signs are all there, and the war being a prolonged one?
And that's the problem. I don't think anyone can say with any type of fidelity at this point that we know for certain that it's going to be weeks or months or, potentially even years. We just ended a 20-year quagmire when it came to the global war on terror within Iraq and Afghanistan. And this definitely could have the makings of another type of conflict in that same vein. Ultimately, if you're talking about true political change, true regime change, you're talking about a revolution amongst the people. The citizens of Iran have a great deal of autonomy. They have been under the boot of a dictatorship for quite some time now, and it is in no small part up to them, with support from the global community, with the backing of the global community, to rise up and push against it. But if there's going to be any lasting stability, and when you discuss or talk about change, that's how it's going to have to come about.
That change that you mentioned, Mr. Garrison, when the people tried to do it in Iran in January, the deaths were in the tens of thousands, and that figure keeps changing. But it was severe. Let's leave it there. But
severe, yeah.
I want to understand what can happen inside Iran in terms of an uprising when it is not armed. And if there is no way to arm, there is no armed uprising, and US doesn't have boots on ground. It doesn't seem like they want to have boots on ground either. It's going to largely be an air operation. So how does that bring about anything close to a change in the way things have been functioning? Because if there is a new head of state in the similar regime, in the similar manner of this regime, there will again be another development of missiles, so essentially that erodes any chance of achieving any of the objectives that have been laid out so far.
Well, what you're talking about is going back to the overall strategy of a conflict of this magnitude, and that's not for me to disagree. To be clear, what I'm saying is that you can't win or you can't remove a regime. You can't have any lasting change within a government simply from airstrikes. Once the Israel and the U.S. government decided to go into this, there had to be a strategy that included some level of diplomacy or at some level of, or to your point, of boots on the ground. And we have not seen, to your point, any type of buildup of that magnitude. You would be talking about troops in the tens of thousands, if not, more than 100,000 or so. Or you would know and understand that there were some type of regular special operations forces and other clandestine activity that were continuously going on. We have heard some early reports of the potential of arming some Kurds within the region with weapons to allow them to help with some type of revolution and help make it more organic. But again, we've seen this type of activity simply not work in the past. And it shouldn't be the business of external countries taking it upon themselves to try to go through about regime change. So ultimately, if you want to see this happen properly, if you want to see this type of authoritarian government removed, which we all should, there is no small part of diplomacy and sanctions and other key levers within our diplomatic toolkit that need to be leveraged. And right now, all we're seeing is a campaign of bombardment that isn't going to change much.
Right, and Mr. Garrison, as the conflict is entering its sixth year, we're seeing there's a constant, a very steady volley of attacks and counterattacks. There are claims and counterclaims. Now, I just want to understand from a U.S. defense assessment standpoint, how long can Iran, realistically sustain itself? Because we understand that they have been leveraging low-cost drones against the U.S. But given everything, how long do you think they will be able to sustain themselves?
Just to supplement what Diksha is saying, sir, the economics is just not working out, because these are $35,000 drones going, and there are $1 million interceptors being used to take out these low-cost drones. It just doesn't add up.
And it was one of the first things that was flagged within the first couple of days of these campaigns, because the United States have been using a lot of its stockpile to support some of Israel's operations previously. And now, just a day or two ago, the White House had to meet with the defense and industrial base leaders to have in-depth conversations about how they could increase their output in building more munitions. So this is already in day 6. A problem that has already been identified, and Iran was already being focused on a war of attrition. And that's what they're calling this. For them, it's an existential battle. It's a battle for the government, for the regime's survival, and they were already looking at everything they could possibly do to elongate the timelines, to stretch this out, because it is their belief that the United States and Israel won't have the political will to do this, but ultimately it's going to be a question of the actual physical will of being able to make the proper munitions to maintain the type of bombardment that we've seen thus far.
Mr. Garrison, regarding the objectives, one can stretch them, one can understand the nuclear program and having a problem against a country developing nuclear weapons, which you do not trust. But for a country to develop its missiles and to have that as an objective to obliterate a country's missile program, is it not equivalent to saying that you can't have an army of your own, because it was a legitimate government in that country?
Yeah, part of the question here is, well, what type of missiles they have, what are the capabilities, the ranges of the missiles, how are they potentially being utilized, where are their targets? We've had these type of concerns, for instance, with North Korea previously, and their ability with conventional munitions to hit closer targets like Japan. So this isn't out of the realm of previous concerns within U.S. policy with its adversaries. A part of this, too, is the fact that you're also looking at static missile systems versus some of the mobile systems that we're having, and trying to get an understanding of how many systems the country actually has and what they're doing with them, and how they can potentially threaten Israel, who is ultimately our ally in this. So it's not simply that they have missile systems as a part of their military assets, but it's how they're deployed and what ultimate threats they're potentially making. So I don't think any country can ultimately say, when you're talking about conventional munitions, that you can't have X, Y, or Z, but ultimately we're going to ask questions, and if a threat is perceived, then a country is going to act accordingly.
Right, and while the threat has been characterized as existential by Israel as well, and now, of course, Iran, which claims that it was a war that was imposed on them, and it's not a war that has been initiated with them. Now, and if the conflict drags on, we know that the oil prices will rise. Of course, the security risks are going to increase, and there is no quick resolution in sight. And when we talk about the Strait of Hormuz, experts argue that it is too strategic, a waterway, it's too pivotal to be closed for long off. And now U.S. has said that it's going to take control. But how are the American people are going to be convinced of this prolonged war, given that they have been very anti this open-ended conflicts in the past as well that we've seen?
I think the current numbers right now are 21% of the American people are voters polled said they supported the war, only 21%. And that number is going to go down and is likely to go down fairly quickly as oil prices are potentially going to go up exponentially. So that's a lot of questions. And look, Iran has also said, and there's some open intelligence that ultimately says they have the ability to lay out mines, to actually place mines and bombs within the strait itself, and to they plan to do everything they can to threaten any type of ships coming through. So you're going to see even more kinetic activity in that space. The OPEC countries have stepped up and said they're going to do what they can here in the short term to continue to increase their own oil production to have a counterbalance to what we're seeing with the oil coming out of Iran. And the United States does have its own strategic reserves that, when necessary, can be tapped to help reduce some of the pressures there. But I don't disagree with you in the sense that something ultimately is going to have to be determined about how we're going to move forward in defense of the strait, and what the global community is going to find acceptable when it comes to ensuring that the flow of petroleum continues throughout that area.
Well, this is going to have global effects, more global effects very, very soon. And we're heading into day 6 now. No signs of it tapering down. Let's just hope for the best. That was Bishop Garrison joining us. Pleasure speaking with you always.
Thank you for having me.